Hi, I'm Dr. Charles Harry, and this is Cybersecurity for Everyone. In today's video, I want to talk about how we move away from the origins of the internet, the theoretical origins of the internet, into something that is akin to a small prototype, specifically how the government supported that effort. The challenge that we're confronted with is that in the early 1960s, you had a series of researchers all over the world that had conceived of a world of interconnected devices. And these are really just solid ideas, good ideas. And the question is that foundational technologies had not been invented yet. So you have this vision of a different world, but new technologies need to be developed. And the challenge is, how do you convert good ideas into a model that allows you to test them? And more specifically, where do you find the resources to do so? So by the mid-1960s, research had continued at academic institutions on this notion of an interconnected world using packetized data. And by 1966, Lawrence Roberts moves over to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And this is think of it as a think tank for the federal government. And when Lawrence Roberts moves over into this space, he decides that through a white paper that's submitted, he decides that he is going to fund in 1968 a project that becomes known as ARPANET. And ARPANET has, in essence, just a handful of nodes to demonstrate at a prototype level a series of interconnected networks. And those nodes are at the universities of UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. These nodes, and here's a map of the early network topology of ARPANET in 1969, and you can see that it's limited. But the goal of the DARPA project is not to go from good idea to worldwide communications network. It's to demonstrate that there is a real ability to move packetized traffic or data from one part of the earth to the next. In this particular case, mostly focused around the western coast of the United States. So this internetwork concept, we later shortened it to internet, but this internetwork concept is based on the idea that computers can talk to one another by interlinking multiple independent networks together. So you can create a separate network at UCLA, a separate network at Stanford, University of Utah, UC Santa Barbara, but they can talk to one another. So ARPANET, which was funded in 1968 by DARPA, by the federal government, the US federal government, is the first packet switching network in human history. And there are some very specific protocols or instructions that are developed at this time. Two of which are Internet Protocol, which really deals with the location of computers. It's kind of like your address, similar to your home address. But this is an address where the computer resides. And the other is Transmission Control Protocol, which really is about the instructions of how to transfer data between two devices. It's a set of instructions that everyone can agree to. Now, it's important because both of those protocols, developed in the late 1960s, are still in existence today. In fact, are fundamental to the way that the internet works. This is important. So there's some general rules of this internetwork. The first rule is that each distinct network has to stand on its own. They're independent. The second is that communication is made on what we call a best effort basis. So if for whatever reason, because we've taken a bunch of data and we've chopped it up into small pieces that we call packets, if one of those packets, when it's being transmitted, does not make it, it gets retransmitted. So that's the second rule. The third is that there's something, we don't have a name for it at this point, but that we would call a black box, so something that allows us to interconnect these various networks. These black boxes later become what we know as routers. We'll talk more about that in other videos. And then fourth, and this is really important, there is no global control. This inter-network concept does not require that a single organization or government owns the entire network. There is no global control. This is a groundbreaking idea. We have this vision of a limited set of networks that are working together. And it's important to note, when we think back to the 1960s, the late 1960s, we didn't have a world of smart devices. We didn't have a world in which we streamed our entertainment. It was a very, very different world. Something that most folks today probably wouldn't recognize, would have a hard time if they went back in time 50, 60 years ago. They would want to reach for their smartphone, whether it was to connect on the road with their family or friends, or to be able to watch entertainment on demand. That world did not exist. And so back in the 1960s, the researchers and the folks at DARPA had never really considered that the number of networks would be greater than just a handful. The idea was that a small number of networks would be required, primarily for research purposes, and that ARPANET could serve a very useful function by facilitating interactions between research groups. In fact, in the early days of the ARPANET, it was conceived that no more than 256 networks would be required worldwide. Think of that, only 256. As the ARPANET gets built, we'll obviously want to be able to use this network for some purpose. And so we need a couple of good applications that are useful to, for people to actually use this network. And so at the time, only a few applications are available. Things like file transfer protocol, or what we call FTP, is really an ability for us to simply transfer files from one point of the earth to the next. And you think about it, back in the 1960s, if you wanted to move information, let's say it's a report that you've written, and you want to send it from California to, let's say, Boston, how did you do it? Well, guess what? You probably stored that information maybe on a magnetic tape, you put it in a package and you mailed it. Or you gave it to someone, they jumped on an airplane and they flew. That's how you moved information. So file transfer protocol, this ability to use interconnected networks to move data, is groundbreaking at the time. We also may want to allow people to remotely log into other computers. If I'm in Utah and I want to use a computer at Stanford University, if I don't have the ability to remotely log in and use this new inter-network, then what am I doing? I'm either driving there or I'm flying there from Utah to Stanford to use that computer. So Telnet, the ability to remotely log in, is really important. And finally, this concept of electronic mail, email, that we all know and love. Maybe some of us don't like email that much. I know I get several hundred email a day, and sometimes it's a little hard to manage it. But email is also developed in this same time period. Once we've developed a small prototype, a small model of this revolutionary set of ideas, now we have a new challenge. How do we scale it? Government provided the funding to build that small network, to build ARPANET at what we would call a bench scale. But the question is, how do we expand this concept of internetworking and allow it to evolve with other technologies that we start to see emerge in the 1970s and into the early 1980s? Can we leverage this emerging set of data and technologies to increase business productivity? And this becomes a fundamental set of questions in the 1970s and into the early 1980s. In this video, we've talked about how we were able to move from a good idea into a small model prototype that was functional. In our next video, we're going to talk about how the private sector and private sector ingenuity and communities of interest help develop this internetworking concept even further to set us up for a large-scale explosion of internet technologies in the 1980s and the 1990s. See you next time.